Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Aaron Gilchrist in Washington on the first full day of the new Trump administration, and it is a busy one. At this hour, we're awaiting remarks from the president that the new White House press secretary said would be a, quote, massive announcement on infrastructure. We expect it will be about investment in AI infrastructure from private companies. We will bring you those remarks when they happen, but it has already been an extremely consequential first 24 hours for the second Trump administration, with the president signing a flurry of executive orders, action, and memos, many of which push the historic limits of presidential authority. Now, we've seen nearly 50 presidential actions. It is such a long list, it's probably pretty hard to read on your screen there. They include renaming the Gulf of Mexico, emergency measures on energy, making it easier to fire federal workers, pulling out of the World Health Organization, and proclaiming there are only two biological sexes. Many of these initiatives will face legal challenges. We begin, though, with two areas where the president is perhaps making the biggest statement about his authority by directing sweeping action on border security and pardoning or commuting the sentences of more than 1,500 January 6th defendants, including those sentenced for assaulting police officers. Let's start with the border. Here are just some of the actions President Trump announced yesterday: declaring a national emergency at the border, directing the military to come up with a plan to repel what he calls an active invasion, and ending birthright citizenship, despite that right being enshrined in the Constitution. Now, in both scripted and unscripted remarks yesterday, President Trump laid out his far-reaching vision on these issues.
All illegal entry will immediately be halted, and we will begin the process of returning millions and millions of criminal aliens back to the places from which they came.
Can we expect ICE raids in major cities?
I don't want to say when, but it's going to happen. Has to happen, or we're not going to have a country left. We're the only country in the world that does this with birthright, as you know. And it's just absolutely ridiculous. But, you know, we'll see. We think we have very good grounds. People have wanted to do this for decades.
Now, we should note the U.S. is not the only country that recognizes birthright citizenship. Canada and Mexico do it as well. Now, the president's efforts to end birthright citizenship is something that's already facing lawsuits from 20 state attorneys general, the city of San Francisco, the ACLU, and others. In his first hours in office, the president also took the step of pardoning or commuting the sentences for every federal defendant in connection with the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol, which he incited in an effort to cling to power and overturn the 2020 election results. Now, that group includes individuals who violently attacked police officers and leaders of the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys who were convicted of seditious conspiracy. Here's what President Trump had to say about that move.
They've been in jail for a long time already. I see murderers in this country get 2 years, 1 year, and maybe no time. So they've already been in jail for a long time. These people have been destroyed. What they've done to these people is outrageous. There's rarely been anything like it in history, in the history of our country. And even people that were aggressive, and in many cases, I believe they happen to be outside agitators.
Now, there is no evidence that the violence of January 6th was the result of outside agitators. Clemency for rioters, even violent ones, comes despite recent comments from Vice President Vance, Attorney General nominee Pam Bondi, even Trump himself, that he would only grant clemency to non-violent January 6th defendants. Perhaps as a preview of what's to come, when asked for their reactions today, congressional Republicans mostly dodged, with a few equating the actions to pardons by former President Biden. Here's how House Majority Leader Steve Scalise put it.
President Trump pardoned January 6th defendants last night. Do you think it's appropriate to pardon people who assaulted police officers?
Well, first of all, President Trump talked about that during the campaign. Joe Biden said he wouldn't pardon a lot of the people that he pardoned yesterday, breaking his word once again. And, you know, that was a hallmark of his administration.
Joining me now is NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake, NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley, and NBC News Justice reporter Ryan Riley. Garrett, we'll start with you here. The first thing we should ask, what do we know about this upcoming event with President Trump likely in this hour?
Well, this is part of a series of meetings that Donald Trump has been having today. He's been meeting with lawmakers from the House and Senate, and later today he's expected to meet with that Japanese software company billionaire, the leader of SoftBank, who folks might remember he met with during the transition down at Mar-a-Lago to announce a significant investment from that company. This new investment is supposed to be involving AI infrastructure. Details beyond that are a little hard to come by, and it's not clear whether the billions of dollars we're talking about here are in addition to or part of that earlier commitment from the then president-elect and the head of SoftBank. But I think this is part and parcel of kind of an all-out blitz from Donald Trump on issues that he ran on and on kind of taking credit for anything he can when it comes to the economy.
Let's talk about these executive actions now, Garrett. Trump ally Steve Bannon said that this flurry of activity in the early days of the Trump administration is designed to sort of flood the zone, right? Is that what we're seeing here? What can you tell us about the sort of the size and the scope of these orders?
Well, I think there's a couple things at play here. Trump and his team understand that they are a term-limited White House with very narrow majorities in the House and Senate. So if they want to get anything done, particularly anything truly transformational, they probably have to do it quickly, and they may have to do it alone. And you're seeing that in these executive orders and actions, many of which have been either something that Donald Trump explicitly campaigned on or, were implicitly part of his campaign promises, whether it's reinstating, Remain in Mexico or trying to open up American energy with this energy emergency that they've declared. So I don't think it's necessarily a communication strategy of flooding the zone so much as it is they want to, kind of look like and engage in as many of these fights as possible, also with the knowledge that many of these things are going to get tied up in the courts. The Trump team understands that as much as they've had a long runway to prepare these executive orders. The people who will oppose them, like the ACLU and these Democratic attorneys general in many states, have also had a long runway to prepare for what they knew were the Trump team's plans. So, it's probably time to start going to law school at night, Aaron, because I think we're going to be dealing with a lot of these legal cases on all of these issues over the next several months and years. Yeah, I read more legislation in the last couple of days here than I have in many, many years. I do want to ask you, as you look at the sort of the size and the scope of what we're talking about here, what you just laid out there are people in the Trump world who would remind us that this is what he ran on. This was not something that should be surprising. Yeah, and I think that's exactly right, Aaron. I mean, look, there were different elements to this, right? When it came to the January 6th pardons, for example, there were people in Trump's orbit, including his own vice president, who were saying very different things about exactly the scope of what these pardons would be and who they would include. But broadly speaking, Trump talked about the idea of January 6th defendants and convicts as hostages. His first rally as a presidential candidate was in Waco, Texas, where he played some of these, J6 rioters singing the national anthem. There was not a lot of, hidden ball here. This is stuff that he ran on. And I think the Trump team would say, and I think the people who are watching at home are about to feel that this is a sort of an elections have consequences moment, all of it happening in fairly quick succession. So, Garrett, I mean, all indications are this is an opening salvo here, right? Do you have a sense of what comes next? I think we could see additional executive orders from the president, perhaps as early as today. Remember, he had been telegraphing, his team had been telegraphing that they had dozens, nearly 100 executive orders prepared. Despite everything we just showed you, there was still only something like in the low 30s of individual orders that were put in front of the president yesterday. If more of those orders are prepared and ready to go, I don't think there's any reason to expect they'll wait to get them signed and into effect as quickly as they can. All right, Garrett Haig for us on the North Lawn of the White House. Garrett, thank you. Let's turn to Julia and Ryan now. Julia, you cover all things immigration, obviously. What's your read on what we saw from President Trump yesterday, the practical implications of these actions?
Well, look, it's very wide-ranging, but I'm just kind of winding back the clock 8 years, and there was a big, wide-ranging EO that he issued then that didn't actually go as far in reality. So right now, you're looking at the travel ban on steroids. He's saying anyone from any country that we can't fully trust the information they give us can't come into the country. That goes beyond the 5, 7, and 13 they originally landed on in the travel ban of the first Trump administration. Then he's declaring a national emergency to move military to the border. He's ending the CBP One app so that people who had appointments to come here and claim asylum can no longer come in. That's really shutting down asylum as an international obligation that the U.S. has usually upheld. They're now ending that. This is really far-ranging. There's also a registration database. He wants undocumented immigrants to register and be fingerprinted and to somehow hold them accountable. He wants to penalize sanctuary cities if they don't comply. I could go on and on. Really broad. But in practical reasons, the very first thing we've seen are migrants who can't cross the border. In terms of what he can do on birthright citizenship, he's going to have a lot of legal challenges. We've already seen 22 parties challenge that because it's enshrined in the Constitution. And then carrying out mass deportations, That's really hard to do without Congress giving him significantly more funding. He's talking about expanding detention space. It's hard to build it to the level he wants.
And you touched on all the things I wonder about, and I always think it's worth it to sort of pick your brain on what questions you still have, things that are outstanding to you in terms of scope and implementation.
Yeah, well, I got a chance today to actually talk to border czar Tom Homeland right here outside our studios. I ran into him and I just said, look, is anything really changing practically? Because ICE was arresting and deporting people last week. I saw the Biden administration deport 100 people to Honduras and stood there as they boarded the plane. This isn't new. What are these grand sweeping missions you've talked about? Because we've heard so many different details. And he said, I am allocating more manpower to the mission. So that doesn't necessarily mean more detention space, more planes overnight. This could be something, Aaron, where they start to talk about it more than the Biden administration did. But we're really going to have to look at the numbers to see if this is bluster or if there's a real fundamental change happening.
So you think there could be an instance where you have maybe one big action that all the cameras see and it looks like a lot of people being affected, and then it turns into a trickle?
Until they get more money from Congress. And that's where I think that we as the media have to be careful about how we talk about the things that are changing.
Ryan, let me bring you in here. We had J.D. Vance, the vice president, Pam Bondi, and others talk about these violent offenders from January 6th and say that they didn't think that the violent folks should be pardoned or have their sentences commuted, and yet sort of here we are, right? That is the case, right?
That is, yeah, here we are. I mean, that's a good way of putting it. I remember Ted Cruz, I asked him not so long ago about this, and he said, oh, the pardons were just a media thing. That's, even though he, on the day of January 6th or the day after, called it a terrorist attack the year after, and then insisted that it was only the media that was obsessed with these pardons. And what we found out is that the pardons were pretty darn important to Donald Trump. Yeah. And that's what he wanted to get through here. And, really there are only 14 commutations, and everyone else gets a free ride. And that includes everyone from, the really low-level misdemeanor cases where people typically got probation anyway, so practically this isn't going to have much of an impact, all the way up to those felony assault on officers, multiple assaults on officers, just really brutal attacks on officers, and then even the seditious conspiracy cases as well, which, I think the White House line on those would be that, well, technically a couple of those were nonviolent, and that's what they're, talking about there.
And is it actually everyone?
It's everyone.
So nobody left out of these actions. We want to put some statistics up on the screen for people to see about the attack on the Capitol. Can you talk a little bit about some of the people who were pardoned beyond the big names that you just mentioned? Yeah,
DJ Rodriguez is one that really sticks out to me. He's a Donald Trump supporter who was at all these rallies in California, and he actually ended up driving a stun gun into Mike Fanone's neck. And Mike Fanone had a heart attack, and he was just today getting those protective orders against the individuals who attacked him that day. And, we've got the video of DJ Rodriguez confessing to what he did. There's no doubt about what he did. You can watch it frame by frame by frame by frame of him driving that stun gun into Mike Fanone's neck. And you can watch all of these attacks on video. You can watch the body cam video and see it over and over again. And there's just zero reasonable doubt about this. Courts have gone through this. A lot of these people have confessed to it under oath, said, this is what I did, because it's on video, and there's just no denying it. There's no reasonable denying it. And then other people have gone to trial and tried their luck there, but the evidence is just so overwhelming. This is one of the most well-documented crimes in American history. You can, NFL football style, rotate the camera around often and see these assaults taking place. So there's just zero doubt about, the guilt about these people who attacked officers that day, and they're all getting pardons.
Do we know anything about whether or how some of these people might show up in the future? You think about the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. Are they the type who are going to sort of fade into the background now, or are they likely to want the spotlight on them again in support of the president?
I think it's a little bit, there's a couple different passes I could go. I think they're think of themselves as being kind of endorsed by the president now. Because remember, stand back and stand by is that famous line that Donald Trump said during the 2020 debate. And that's what kicked the Proud Boys into high gear. That was a huge merchandising bonanza for them. And that's really when they started growing and organizing. In fact, Enrique Tarrio's lawyer, who wrote that nice little letter to Donald Trump asking for a pardon, when he was standing in front of a jury, said, actually, this was all Donald Trump's fault because they grew so quickly that they couldn't do vetting. And it's all because Donald Trump said stand back and stand by. So, there's a little bit of switching here and saying exactly what, they feel as though they need to say in order to make these moves happen. But, all of these officers, I think, are feeling today probably a gut punch because, it's something that happened to them that isn't going to be accounted for.
Yeah, but I bet there is more to come. So, you guys, we appreciate your reporting on this. Ryan, Julia, thank you.
Thanks.
Well, all of this comes as NBC News has exclusive new reporting that potentially could complicate the confirmations of President Trump's pick to lead the Pentagon, Pete Hegseth. Senators today received an affidavit from Hegseth's former sister-in-law, Danielle Hegseth, saying that his behavior caused his second wife, Samantha Hegseth, to fear for her safety. Now, according to a redacted copy of the affidavit that was reviewed by NBC News, Danielle says that part of her reason for coming forward is, quote, because I have been assured that making this public statement will ensure that certain senators who are still on the fence will vote against Hegseth's confirmation. But for that assurance, I would not subject myself or others referred to in this statement to the public scrutiny this statement is likely to cause. Samantha Hegseth told NBC News via email that, quote, I do not believe your information to be accurate and that there was no physical abuse in my marriage. NBC News senior national political reporter Sahil Kapoor joining me now with more on this. So, Sahil, how did this affidavit come so close to a vote on Pete Hegseth's confirmation?
Hey, Aaron. Well, this affidavit came in response to a January 18th letter from the top Democrat on this committee, Jack Reed, the Rhode Island Democrat, just 3 days ago, and it came today. So this is partly what's going on here is that this request that led to this affidavit came late, just a few days ago, on the cusp of when the Senate is expected in the coming days potentially to vote on the Pete Hegseth nomination on the floor. Now, the senators received this affidavit today. That's according to reporting from our colleagues Julie Sirkin, Sarah Fitzpatrick, and Courtney Cuby, detailing behavior, threatening and erratic conduct, Danielle Hegseth alleges, that caused his second wife, Pete Hegseth's second wife, to fear for her safety. This was also partly in response to Jack Reed and other Democrats believing that the background check conducted as a custom for all of these nominees was inadequate with regard to Pete Hegseth. What happens here is unknown. The impact of this is unknown, but it's certainly something that senators are now paying attention to.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you as you talk about the impact here. Is there any indication that this could change how senators move on this, how they might vote on this?
It's a little bit early to know at this point, Aaron, but here's the basic situation. There are 53 Republicans in the chamber. They need 50 votes to confirm a nominee. At this point, I would not, if I were them, bank on any Democratic support. Now, there are only two members of the Senate Republican Conference who have any real history of bucking the party. That's Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins. We don't know how they're going to vote, but even if they vote no, several more Republicans have to vote no. Pete Hegseth was cleared in committee on a party line vote yesterday of just 14 to 13. So the big question becomes, are more Republicans going to rethink this? Everyone had been looking for a long time at Senator Joni Ernst, the Iowa Republican, who had been skeptical of Pete Hegseth from the outset, made that pretty clear, but recently came out in favor of him. Now, one thing that I did hear from Republicans about Pete Hegseth is that most of the reports, most of the allegations about him are from anonymous sources. Here we have a source on the record named detailing these allegations. Will that move votes? TBD.
Yeah, we'll be watching it. I do want to touch a couple of other topics with you here, Sahil. Before last night, there were many congressional Republicans who had said that some J6 convicts should not be pardoned, right? How are Republicans reacting now to President Trump's decision to pardon all of the defendants?
Yeah, we're seeing a mix of responses. Republicans in the Senate were certainly taken aback, at least some of them, by the scope of Donald Trump's pardons of January 6th rioters. There had been a view among senators that, maybe the ones who just trespassed and didn't really engage in violence themselves could use a pardon, that wasn't, necessarily a deal breaker for some. But the fact that Trump went so far as to pardon violent January 6th rioters, some of whom attacked law enforcement officers, is getting some pushback from Capitol Hill of the sort that we don't usually see with Trump. Some of them are simply saying they appreciate Capitol Police kind of dodging this issue. But others, like Susan Collins, say they don't believe it was appropriate to pardon violent rioters. Even Senator Josh Hawley, the reliable Trump ally, said he would not have done that. He would not have pardoned violent January 6th rioters. Our colleague Kate Santelise caught up with the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune. Take a listen to how he responded.
Senator, are you comfortable with these pardons for January 6 offenders?
Sorry. As I said before, we're looking forward to the next 4 years, not the last 4.
What message does this send to police officers who were there that day?
If we're the party of law and order, what about the officers? What about the people that were attacked? The officers that were attacked that day?
You guys ask the same questions of Biden.
And that's another category of response we're seeing from Republicans. Why are you talking about this Trump pardon? Why are you not talking about Joe Biden pardoning his family members on the way out. Aaron.
All right, Sahil Kapoor for us on Capitol Hill. Sahil, thank you. And coming up, President Trump's new border battles. A former Homeland Security Secretary reacts to the president's many actions on immigration, including ending birthright citizenship. You're watching Meet the Press now. And welcome back. As we said, on his first day in office, President Trump began cracking down on immigration, both in his rhetoric and in his executive actions. That includes ordering the U.S. military to come up with a plan to seal the border.
I will send troops to the southern border to repel the disastrous invasion of our country. Under the orders I signed today, we will also be designating the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations.
President Trump, if cartels are now going to be seen as foreign terror organizations, would you think about ordering U.S. Special Forces into Mexico to take them out?
Could happen. Stranger things have happened.
Joining me now is NBC's Courtney Cuby at the Pentagon. Also with me, Jay Johnson, Homeland Security Secretary in the Obama administration. Courtney, let me ask you here, as we heard so much about the use potentially of the military, the president says that he would use the military to repel an invasion. What's your understanding of what that might look like and what sort of limitations there might be on U.S. troops when they're deployed domestically?
Yeah, so there already are U.S. troops at the border. Remember, there's about 7,000 right now. It's about 2,500 who are under Title X status. Basically, what that means is they are federally activated. So they're not necessarily all active duty. They could be guard or reserve, but they are on federal active duty orders. There's also another 4,500 or so who are actually National Guard troops. And there's a big distinction there, Aaron. Why that is exactly what you asked about, what they can and cannot do. So if you are a federally activated soldier, member of the U.S. military, a service member, you cannot engage in law enforcement activities in the United States domestically. It is against something called the Posse Comitatus Act, and it comes up every so often. You know, viewers might look at that or might listen to that and think, Posse Comitatus, what is that? But it actually does come up very, relatively often. We think about things like riots, protests. The U.S. military, active duty, cannot be brought in a law enforcement capacity. What they can do is support law enforcement, though, with as long as it's not directly related to a law enforcement activity. National Guard is a little bit different. The big question here, though, Aaron, is how many, if any, more U.S. military will President Trump decide he wants to send there to repel, as he said, this invasion? And what exactly would they be used to do that? We still don't know the answers to that. There's an executive order that came out that talked about some things that the U.S. military could do, like building barracks and some construction and engineering and things, but we still don't exactly know how many more troops or exactly what they could be doing.
So there's also this part of the order that tells U.S. Northcom to work on plans to seal the southern border, right? Is it clear if those plans are already being worked on and who exactly might be doing it?
Yeah, I mean, look, the executive order went out. Northcom, I imagine, jumped right on that. But we've asked the question and we don't have an answer yet whether, in fact, they have begun that. But it's also what we're trying to figure out is exactly what that would mean, sealing the border. And again, while there are U.S. military troops that are down there, it would theoretically, if they're talking about sealing the border with U.S. military, that could be, we're talking thousands more U.S. military troops who would have to be involved in that, even if it is in supporting law enforcement for it. But again, Aaron, there are so many questions. These executive orders came out pretty quickly last night, and we don't have a lot of answers still to this, even right now.
I do want to get your thoughts, though, about sort of broader implications on using the U.S. military to enforce border security, manpower issues. I mean, does the Pentagon have enough people to sort of move to this type of mission versus what we would typically think of as military missions?
Yeah, I mean, the military could put people down there if they wanted to, even right now when there are a lot of engagements overseas. Now, here's the thing. Recruiting has been a problem for the past several years. It has ticked up more in 2024, and even it's early in 2025. But recruiting has been a problem for several years now. And the reality is, historically, it usually will take years to recover from recruiting deficits. That being said, if there was a need for troops to go to the border, whether they be active duty or National Guard, the military has enough to send there, but it would be at the detriment to other potential missions. So whether they be overseas missions, support missions, whatever it is, if we're talking National Guard troops from other states, they actually have things they have to do in their home states. So it would potentially pull away from other things. You know, one other thing that I just found fascinating that we've also been trying to get to the bottom here is the cartels. You mentioned, now that that they have been designated a foreign terror organization, could they be used to go across the border? That's another thing we've been asking. President Donald Trump last night left that window open, Aaron.
All right, Courtney Kube for us at the Pentagon today. Courtney, thank you for that. I want to turn to Jay Johnson now, former Homeland Security Secretary. Mr. Secretary, thank you for making time for us today. I want to dive right in here. As you think about these immigration executive actions that we learned about last night, knowing that things Courtney just talked about, assigning troops and the like, would be attaching them to Homeland Security functions that are under the Department of Homeland Security. How enforceable, how actionable are some of these executive orders, and how long might it take to implement some of them?
Well, first, before I was Secretary of Homeland Security, I was the General Counsel of the Department of Defense. Courtney described the legal authorities and the prohibitions well. In general, the U.S. military is not deployed domestically for what we refer to as a posse comitatus, domestic law enforcement. Add to that that our active duty military is not trained for interdicting women and children at our southern border. So there's that. They have been deployed in support. That is not a new concept. In answer to your question, there are a number of these executive orders that raise serious legal issues, and I'm quite sure that there will be lawsuits attached to most, if not all of them. I learned in college, before I even went to law school, that you cannot change a constitutional right, something enshrined in the Constitution, by a mere executive order. You just can't do that. Birthright citizenship has existed since 1868. In the 14th Amendment, which was created to guarantee citizenship to my enslaved ancestors. The amendment says that those born in this country, those naturalized in this country, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are U.S. citizens. And the word subject to the jurisdiction thereof is generally meant to exclude people, kids born of diplomats in this country. It is also an executive order that basically shuts down asylum. People have a legal right to make a claim for asylum in this country. An executive order that terminates the app appointment program by the prior administration, which appeared to be working. And then on the more practical aspect of all of this, we need to maintain a good, strong relationship with the government of Mexico. A lot of the reasons why the numbers have been down on our southern border for the last 6 months is because the Mexicans have agreed to do a lot to interdict migrants on their southern border, which is only 300 miles long, with Central America. So threatening to send U.S. military to the sovereign country of Mexico, an executive order, remain in Mexico, does not help that relationship, which is key to addressing this problem.
I'm almost out of time here, but I do want to ask you also, we are expecting the president to implement this mass deportation plan that you referenced, in particular targeting these Democrat-run cities. We've heard his borders are telling local officials to get out of the way. We also learned that DHS has rescinded restrictions that kept ICE agents from conducting arrests in schools and churches and other locations like that. Is there anything that states or cities can do to block those sorts of efforts, that sort of movement?
Yes. City councils, state legislatures can enact ordinances or laws that basically forbid local law enforcement from working with ICE. You know, I used to say to my people, including Tom Homan, when he worked at ICE, when I was secretary, do things that are controversial in a particular community. You turbocharge the sanctuary cities movement and make it harder to get at the true public safety threats that we need to interdict and, if they're undocumented, deport. So this could be a huge setback in the wrong direction.
All right, we will leave it there for now. Former Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson, sir, we appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
And up next, President Trump takes on TikTok, climate change, LGBTQ rights, and more. A live report from the White House on the dozens of other consequential actions the president took on day one and what else to expect in his first 100 days. You're watching Meet the Press now.
My recent election is a mandate to completely and totally reverse a horrible betrayal and all of these many betrayals that have taken place, and to give the people back their faith, their wealth, their democracy, and indeed their freedom. From this moment on, America's decline is over. Many people thought it was impossible for me to stage such a historic political comeback. But as you see today, here I am. The American people have spoken.
And welcome back. As we mentioned earlier, President Trump has made good on his vow to take swift action with what he describes as a mandate from the American people, signing dozens of executive orders and actions just hours after taking office on everything from environmental policy and social issues to the looming TikTok ban and the federal workforce. NBC News White House correspondent Vaughn Hilliard joins me now. So, Vaughn, President Trump made good on the vow to delay the ban on TikTok. How much power does he actually have to delay this law, and what happens in this 75 days now that TikTok has?
Right. That's really the outstanding question, is the extent to which the law that was signed in a bipartisan fashion last year by Congress and then signed into law by President Biden ultimately makes the companies like Apple and Google that make the app available on their platform susceptible to lawsuits and concerns about security. This is a moment where, for Donald Trump, by seeking to extend this, he had suggested yesterday that China should seek to find a willing buyer, investor, American investor to partner with to ensure that there's not concerns, or I guess you could say less concern about the security, the national security of Americans, more than 170 million that use the app. And he said that he would all but force the hand of China to team up with an American investor into the app by threatening up to 100% of tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the United States. So there's a lot of questions still. And even if Donald Trump, now president, says that his Department of Justice will not pursue litigation against either Google or Apple, it does not mean that there are still not outstanding questions for each of these companies that would be making such a decision. And again, the parent company of TikTok, the Chinese company, has given still no indication at this point in time that they have any intention of divesting any of the app and any of the business to an American company.
So there's more to come on that. I do want to ask you about a few other things here. The president signed this executive order instructing the federal government, federal agencies, to recognize two sexes, male and female. They made a distinction between the word gender and sex as well. What's your understanding here? What are the immediate effects of this particular EO?
Right. Back in 2022, then President Biden, he made the option for Americans on passports and other federal documents to choose a gender as described by X. And the Trump administration is now making it clear that one must either be a male or female, and that it is a sex designation based off of the reproductive parts that somebody is born with here. Of course, this also comes to questions about the protections for transgender military personnel, among other litany of questions here, as the departments and agencies Donald Trump is instructed to roll back protections for not only transgender individuals, but other DEI efforts here. And of course, this is at the forefront. There is still outstanding questions whether he will seek to put forward an executive order that were to somehow try to challenge whether transgender individuals are able to use the bathroom of their choosing or to partake in particular school sports. So there's still a lot of outstanding questions based on what Donald Trump articulated on the campaign trail, but this was a first step here on his first day in office.
There was one other executive order that withdraws the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement. We know he did that in his first term as well. Is this second withdrawal more binding than the first one was?
Right. It was actually President Macron who, after the first Trump administration, suggested that such actions as this calls into question the reliability of the United States as partners in such agreements as this. There's 194 other parties who are party to the Paris Climate Accord. And this effort here by the Trump administration goes a step further by encouraging and asserting and directing oil and the federal government to seek expansion of drilling on federal waters and federal land. And so at a time in which there are efforts through the Paris Climate Agreement to cut back on carbon emissions, the current president of the United States is urging an expansion of drilling and oil and gas production in the United States as there's heightened concern about the impacts of climate change and the ever-increasing temperature of the globe. Aaron.
All right. Vaughn Hilliard for us here in Washington. Vaughn, thank you. And after the break, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio reacting to President Trump's sweeping pardons for more than 1,000 January 6th defendants as he becomes the first confirmed cabinet member of Trump's second administration. The panel's up next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. And welcome back. Joining me now is the panel. Shelby Talcott, reporter at Semaphore. Naveen Nayak, president and executive director at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. And Danielle Pletka, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and an NBC News contributor. Searching for something to talk about today. So many topics. Shelby, I'll start with you. We saw two different Trumps yesterday. The scripted inaugural address version of President Trump, and then there was the more freewheeling version that we saw at several other points throughout the day yesterday. What's your reaction to what we saw from this not incoming anymore, this now new administration that we have in front of us?
Well, I don't think it's surprising in terms of the two different Trumps we saw, because we saw that a lot on the campaign trail. We saw moments where he was very structured and focused on the speeches, and then we saw the moments where he would go off speech. I was actually surprised in the first speech that he didn't go off of the script at all, really, compared to the second one where it didn't seem like he had a script whatsoever. But I think also it shows, over the past 2 months, everybody in Trump's orbit has been telling me that they have been acutely focused on day one and the first week. And I think that is evident because he came into office. He was ready to sign all of these executive orders. He did it with kind of pomp and circumstance. He was at Capital One Arena signing them. He sat down and did a lengthy impromptu interview with a bunch of reporters as he signed things. That was all intentional, and that was what his team was preparing for over the last 2 months.
And I mean, was this more of a, we think about actions versus words, right? You got a lot of the rhetoric leading up to yesterday, and then you got this action that matched the rhetoric that we've been hearing for the most part?
Yeah, I think, everything that Donald Trump said on the campaign trail over the past few months is what he is implementing now. This is a case where Donald Trump's words over the past 2 years on the campaign trail have transitioned into what he plans to do in office.
Naveen, what's your read on that? I mean, is that we got exactly what we should have been expecting from him, and were Democrats prepared for it?
I think the American people are not sure, because the whole storyline during the campaign is, well, it's just words. Don't pay attention to Donald Trump's words. You had Republicans saying he's not going to defend the pardon the January 6th people, certainly not the violent ones. Well, I don't think the American people voted for that. He went really hard at the clean energy industry, right? Like really took a hatchet to wind energy, solar energy, stopping all offshore wind projects. That is a huge hurt to the American workers in this country. That is taking clean, affordable energy off the grid when he says we have an energy emergency in this country. I don't think that's what the American people voted for. And so I do think, to the point which she just made, we should pay attention to his actions now. And I think there are a lot of actions here the American people did not vote for.
Democrats are going to spend some time saying, look, you get this, you got exactly what you wanted. This is, look at what you're getting. Is there a point at which Democrats then have to decide these are the things that we need to focus on, that these are the implementable things? as opposed to just the shiny things that are out there? And then what do they do with that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I do think we have to stop paying attention to his words. The tariffs is a good example. He's intentionally playing this game. We'll find out on February 1st. Initially, it was supposed to be a day one action. It didn't happen. I do think there's a couple of threads here that I think we've got to be pulling on our side. One is he promised to help working people. And so I think every time he goes against that, there is an executive order that's gotten very little attention on prescription drugs, taking away $2 generics. That's a real thing for a family that depends on, or a senior that depends on that. So I think we've got to drive that thread when he is enriching the wealthy at the cost of the middle class. One of the memorable images yesterday was the $1 trillion of wealth from a handful of billionaires standing there sort of cheering on Donald Trump. Is that who he is going to be working for? And the second one, sort of related, is this sort of corruption, whether it's political corruption and pardoning the January 6 people because they're his supporters, or, straight up economic corruption. I think those are the threads that seem to be emerging for our side.
Danny, I want to ask you about the pardons and commutations that we saw last night from the president. And we'll put something up on the screen that was written today by Aaron Blake about this as it relates to the January 6 rioters. It says, regardless of the merits of any individual pardon, the breadth of Trump's January 6 pardons and the fact that they were not all targeted cannot help but send a message that he will do what he can to protect those who rise up and even assault police officers in his defense. What do you make of that? Do you agree with that message? Is that the message that Trump is sending now with these actions taken last night?
I don't think that that's the intended message from President Trump. I think the intended message is that many of the January 6th individuals who were incarcerated for political reasons. And when there was a discussion about dividing between people who had in fact committed acts of violence and between people who had not, I think that was a lot more defensible than the blanket pardon that he saw. The problem for a lot of us is that with the politicization of the pardon process, with the politicization of the justice system, it goes both ways. We saw President Biden go out in his last moments and pardon his entire family for crimes that I suspect we will never know fully about. We saw him in his last moments commute the sentence of somebody who murdered 2 FBI agents. When we see these kinds of things, it demeans the pardon power in our eyes, and it demeans the justice system. Unfortunately, now we've seen both parties engage in this, and I'm not quite sure how we restore our faith in this system.
I was going to say, because it doesn't cancel, they don't cancel each other out. Two wrongs don't make a right, or do they in this instance?
No, I don't think they do. I don't think two wrongs cancel each other out, and I don't think that either of our presidents made outstanding decisions in this regard. However, I think that the choice here is to try to restore the faith of the American people in the justice system. And that means abandoning the kind of lawfare that we've seen over the last 4 years. It means having a policy where your words match your actions. In some ways, Donald Trump has made the promises, kept the promises. In some ways, I think he's probably disappointed people. It's only day one.
Yeah, it's only day one. Shelby, I want to ask you about Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State. He was asked about the January 6 pardons. I want to play a little bit of what he said.
What message does pardoning nearly all of them send to the rest of the world?
Well, we're going to focus on what makes America stronger and more prosperous and safer. I'm not going to engage in domestic political debates. I can't. In the role at State Department, my job is to focus on the president's foreign policy.
And so Rubio's job now as Secretary of State is to talk about democratic priorities and values and to promote the U.S. values around the world. What do you make of that answer?
I'm not surprised. I think a lot of Republicans at this point have the opinion of this was Donald Trump's decision, whether I agree with it or not. He is the president, and I'm not going to speak out publicly against him. Now, we have seen some do that, right? Mitch McConnell told my colleague earlier today that he disagreed with the decision for Donald Trump to pardon some of those more violent offenders. But by and large, I think the Republican Party is of the mindset right now that Donald Trump won the election, and there are fights that they are going to choose to pick, and there are fights that are not worth picking. And they have decided that this is a fight that is just not worth picking.
I think we're all waiting to find out which is a fight they would actually pick with Donald Trump, because I think that is an open question, right? The party now is his, and they've not shown any willingness on anything. I mean, it is really hard to defend letting the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers leaders out. I don't think anyone can stand there with a straight face. These are people who beat the crap out of police officers and are being let out.
Did they murder 2 FBI agents? Because,
But that was not a personal, that was not like a lot of people, including Donald Trump, has used the pardon in that way. He's also, there was a police officer, there was someone in Florida who he released last time who killed a police officer. This is something that presidents have done. This was to his own personal political benefit. I think you see the difference. I agree that the Biden actions, raise it, but it's a different concern. Do you think Joe Biden would have in any world pardoned his family if Donald Trump wasn't threatening to go after them?
I think
did he pardon them when he was vice president?
In which Joe Biden would have pardoned his son and his family, just like we live in the world in which he coerced people who had security clearances to claim that his son's laptop was Russian disinformation. I think, unfortunately, we live in that kind of world. We would like our presidents to be better, but I would suggest to you that so far, our last president didn't set a very fine example.
And we will have to leave it there for this particular conversation. Naveen, Danny, Shelby, thank you all. Still to come, President Trump looks to shake up the U.S. economy while ordering government agencies to deliver emergency price relief to Americans. What it means for workers and voters. You're watching Meet the Press now. And welcome back. President Trump included a number of economic policies in his day one executive order blitz, including actions that establish a, quote, America First trade policy, calling for a review of trade agreements and policies, declaring a national energy emergency to allow more drilling and energy production, rescinding former President Biden's his administration's economic policies, and ordering executive agencies to deliver emergency price relief. President Trump's orders did not include the immediate establishment of tariffs, despite his past promises to put tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, and China on his first day in office. But he maintained tariffs could be coming.
Well, we're thinking in terms of 25% on Mexico and Canada because they're allowing vast numbers of people. Canada's a very bad abuser also. Vast numbers of people to come in and fentanyl to come in.
When do you think you would enact them?
I think February 1st.
Joining me now with insight into the president's economic agenda is NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Roman. So, Christine, I'm interested in your headlines from all this, right? Can you break down Trump's economic executive orders for us? What could they mean for our economy in the coming months and beyond?
Well, it's an aggressive, ambitious agenda, and Trump is trying to remake this economy. In fact, he's trying to pick up where he left off after his first term and go even further there. That America First trade policy, it doesn't make tariffs on day one, which he had promised. So he punted on the tariffs on day one. But a member of his trade team told me it's a matter of when and how much, not if. They want to take a look at all of the trade deficits and really establish what's going wrong with these trade relationships in their view, and figure out the best way to attack it. That national energy emergency to unleash more drilling, they feel, from their perspective, the Biden administration was at war with fossil fuels and too in love with climate initiatives, and they want to just reverse and undo all of that. And frankly, they believe that if you can cut energy prices, oil prices, they wouldn't give any kind of price that they think that oil and gas could be, but if you could cut it, they think the prices for everything else fall as well. And then finally, you mentioned that, that memorandum of understanding telling all the agencies, hey, look, you have to find ways to reduce costs and improve the standard of living for Americans through all of the different agencies. That's mostly symbolic. It's not as if the White House was going out and signing an executive order telling companies, for example, you must lower prices, or you must scrimp on your own profit margins to make sure people are paying less. There was nothing sort of actionable like that.
So in 20 seconds, can you talk a little bit more about the tariff potential economic impact that could have if and when they are put in place?
I mean, Main Street, Wall Street economists say it would add to inflation and cut GDP. The president disagrees. He does not believe mainstream economists. So we will see.
We will see. That seems like the ultimate answer on a lot of things here lately. Christine Romans for us. Christine, thank you.
Nice to see you.
You too. And we're back with more Meet the Press Now tomorrow, but the news continues right now with Hallie Jackson.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.